In Australia, we tend to see three models that are predominantly used: an opt-in, an opt-out, or an implied consent model. Now, these three models, the first two obviously are the flip side of one another in a sense. An opt-in is an explicit grant of consent by an individual. It's an affirmative action, and it's required to be made before information is collected, used, or shared. It's someone consenting for that process to happen, whatever it may be. An example might be to say that you've joined a new mailing list, or perhaps you're dealing with a new retailer online, and you might agree to receive marketing emails by ticking a box that says, I would like to receive further offers, marketing information, those sorts of offers that we commonly see. Opt-in has a lot of advantages in that it's clear, it's unambiguous, it's the person taking a deliberate action in order to share their personal information for a purpose that they have decided. It may be limited to one-off situations or short-term, or it may also endure through a much longer customer relationship. So whether you're going to the movies and you want to, take some offers around the launch of a movie, or whether you're dealing with your bank and you've been dealing with them for many, many years, opt-in is very pervasive and powerful. Opt-out is the opposite in a sense. It's data collection or use is going to be assumed by the organisation that we deal with unless the individual explicitly objects or withdraws their consent, and that's the opt-out action. So it's kind of the opposite, but of course it is putting the initial power in the hands of the organisation who is using the personal information. Examples that we commonly see are on SMS messages, so the stop command, or sometimes that's a link. If you don't want to receive further SMSs, it might say reply stop. Personally, I tend to prefer those. I don't love links in SMS. They sometimes can be a bit of a worry for phishing. And so I don't tend to touch those ones myself. Obviously, opt-out is somewhat limited in its utility for a consumer. First of all, you have to have received a marketing message, and then you need to act on this particular mechanism that's been designed by the organisation. And sometimes that can be a bit hard. It can be a bit hard to find, how do I opt out exactly if we're looking at a big website that has a lot of information on it. Effective opt-out mechanisms, therefore, they need to be clearly communicated. They obviously need to be functional. They can't just be a dead letter. And they need to be easy to locate and easy for people to use. The final mechanism of consent is the implied consent. Now, consent is, in these scenarios, inferred from an individual's actions or their established relationships with the organisation that is relying on the implied consent. Again, with this one, the power is in the hands of the organisation. A patient visiting a doctor is an example, perhaps, of implied consent due to the nature of the relationship. If the doctor needs to refer the patient to another medical practitioner, or perhaps for some x-rays, the doctor is going to send some information about that patient to the new practitioner to introduce them, a referral, for example, and to explain what's needed. So in those situations, there is a sharing of personal information. There's probably not a specific privacy notice at that point in time. It's an implied consent. Implied consent can be complex though, and guidelines need to be really carefully followed by organisations if they're relying on implied consent. So when we look at how do we find information about the consent that we need to either give or an opt-out, for example, where do we look? Consent forms are the first sort of stop, I guess, that we've probably known for some decades. Often originally in paper, and we still see them commonly in paper, perhaps when we're signing up for a new service in person with someone, perhaps when we are at the doctor, going back to that example there, or maybe our accountants when we're signing off on our annual returns and those sorts of things, which often still do need to be on paper sometimes. Those will tend to carry consent notices, sometimes on their own, on a single sheet of paper, and sometimes embedded with other content. The other important disclosure is a privacy notice. Now, that's a clear upfront statement explaining what personal data is, how it's used and with whom it's shared, and its control options for the individual. It's a little different from a privacy policy, which tends to be an explanation of how an organisation approaches privacy. Privacy notice tends to be tailored to a specific context or scenario or product or service, and it's trying to describe what are the personal information transactions or interactions that are taking place in that product or service. Checkboxes. We see them all the time, right? And I mentioned, just a little earlier on there, with an opt-in, we expect a checkbox to be unfilled so that the individual gets to choose to click on it. We commonly see them in the opt-ins, during sign-ups, sometimes off the back of a transaction or a service that we've undertaken, booking a hotel room, for example. Do I want to have some promotions from the local area? Or in pop-ups or banners, those sorts of areas we often see as we're navigating the internet and encountering new providers or new businesses that we haven't dealt with. A preference console is something that's come about in particularly recent years, and it's an enablement of users to take privacy into their own hands. It enables a user to decide on a day-to-day basis, really, whether or not they do want to continue to take those offers or share information, or whether or not they want information to be transferred to another party on their behalf. And it's really generally a toggle, a yes-no toggle, but they're really useful for organisations because as an organisation changes, as its processes change, new preference console items can be added or removed. And that's very practical. It's really practical for users, and users tend to remember that this was a really useful thing, and they tend to remember where it is and come back to it so that they can manage it. It's also easy to link to for the organisation. So in a consent strategy, there's probably, I think, about 7 really key points: clarity, granularity, accessibility, record keeping. Sensitive personal data we need to think about. Sensitive personal data often requires additional consents compared to the non-sensitive personal data that we deal with, particularly health records, those sorts of things, information about gender, sexuality, political views, union membership, these sorts of areas. Regulatory requirements are something that we always need to think. They're always in the background, and with a consent model, we need to really think about our regulations, because consent is one of our pillars, one of our cornerstones of privacy management. And as regulations change, it's highly likely that we see consent impacted by regulatory change. And then established relationships. And as I mentioned before, implied consent sometimes is valid in certain established relationships. That can sometimes come from other acts, such as the Spam Act in Australia. The Spam Act is not all about privacy, but it's all about marketing, and it's a layer of marketing law that exists alongside of the Privacy Act and its requirements on marketing. And so, we sort of do need to think about how our relationships work within our business and within our organisations and beyond, but we also need to understand what might influence that from a legal perspective as well.